What we also start to see in the 1940s, especially with this move toward the urban centers, is what is considered to be the urban folk revival. So this is led by Pete Seeger and other folk time singers who looked at the old time folk music practices and the string band practices that we saw a few slides ago. And they essentially tried to revamp and reintroduce this music to young people in the United States in the 1940s. So it became this kind of pop folk music fad. And part of this was a reaction against the urbanized bluegrass music that had become really flashy and showy and presentational, essentially. Pete Seeger and others like him, they wanted this. They wanted to return to a sense of down home, rural simplicity. They felt that bluegrass music didn't truly represent folk, so there was this notion of the urban folk revival. And in this case, um, we could think of revival as a type of resurgence, right? A return to a popular kind of style that's existing today. And we see this all the time. Has anyone noticed any revivals in popular music today? Any returns back to any kinds of earlier music styles? And feel free to type in the chat. Yes. Oh yeah, yeah. Banjos definitely. 80s synth, that's huge. I would say 70s disco, right? Think about BTS and Dynamite, right? Think about Dua Lipa. A lot of these people are drawing back to 1970s disco. Oh, to Pimp a Butterfly? Yeah, like are you talking about jazz influence into Pimp a Butterfly? Because that's definitely a pretty heavy jazz kind of album. Yeah. So this is pretty constant. Think about 2000s pop punk, think about Blink 182, Sum 41 and folks like that. They were reviving earlier punk practices from the 70s, right? So this is a constant pattern. So the same thing happens with folk over and over again in the 1940s. People look back to this older style of music and they try to return it to popularity. And generally this involves people who are outside of the original tradition coming from the outside and essentially trying to revive this particular tradition. And so part of why the urban folk revival was so important to people was because people like Pete Seeger, and then later on Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, they felt like uh, if you to make music in the United States, you had to become a superstar or celebrity, right? Especially after Elvis and rock and roll broke out in the 1950s, there was this pressure of like you had to be this global superstar if you wanted to make music, right? You had to specialize in it, you had to be professional. So, when the Beatles broke out, that also created this international music craze. So, certain people wanted to figure out a way to make music without the pressures of stardom and having to specialize in something. And they wanted to make music that had some sort of sense of home, right? They felt like the popular music that was being produced in the 40s and 50s and 60s was becoming too impersonal, right? It's just being too generalized. And some people really wanted to figure out how to make music that had a sense of tradition and home. And this is what I meant before of how traditions get invented, right? So here's an example of Pete Seeger, and Pete Seeger played a lot at colleges. He did this folk kind of music for a lot of political reasons, and got into the mind of young people of who wanted to connect to some sort of sense of home or to strip back. So let's check a little bit of this out. Sorry, it's soft.
This song was put together back in the 1930s.
Notice the talking style, right? The narrative, kind of like Gid Tanner and the Skilt Lickers, and just like the early European ballads we talked about before.
By a fellow some of you may know. His name was Woody Guthrie. Woody has been in a hospital now for 10 years. Probably won't write another song. But he was one of the greatest ballad makers I guess I'll ever know. Wrote songs about the Dust Bowl, about the crops of California, wrote songs for his children. A lot of people have heard his songs. They're getting more and more well-known every year. But I thought maybe right now you'd be interested to perhaps see him. This is him.
In the dead hours of night, she rose from her blanket, a battle to fight. She rose from her blanket with a gun in each hand, said, come all of you cowboys, fight for your land.
So there was kind of this desire, especially among college students, young people, intellectuals, that were really politically engaged too, to try and look back and say, let's return to a simpler time, right? We've become too consumerism. We've become too wrapped up in capitalism and all this modernist thinking. Let's go back to this simpler time of this folk and this old time music making. So it's in some ways very romanticized. Like I like this video clip of Woody Guthrie here because this is what some people were envisioning, right? All you need is an acoustic guitar and a simple life, right? Just make music. Let's get away from all this complexity of modern life. And so this is where future generations of folk revival singers, now we're talking about the 1960s, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan start to draw from too, right? Oh, hello. So folk music, right, starts to become synonymous with singer-songwriter, essentially, people who accompany themselves on guitars and usually write their own songs or draw from older songs and adapt them. And what's kind of interesting in this case is that these folk singers now, they become stars in their own right? They become these urban folk legends and folklore tellers. And so here's another example of Joan Baez and Bob Dylan singing. And they're singing from this really, one of the foundational country music artists, Hank Williams. So notice how they're drawing back from this practice of home. Oh, okay. There's a really good movie about 1960s folk music in Greenwich Village called Inside Llewellyn Davis. Oh, I have to check that out. Let me make a little note of that. Yeah, I would say the 1960s folk music was so important, especially because it connected so much to the types of politics and social thinking at that time, right? Think about how turbulent the 1960s were. I would argue that we're kind of experiencing a cultural turbulence right now akin to the 1960s. When so much happened politically and socially and environmentally. And so this folk music was such an important part of advancing people's political goals and uniting people, right? To fight against certain forces, to fight for civil rights especially. All right. So let me play a little bit of this and just notice how, again, these young urbanites are looking back to these older early commercial country superstars to try and draw a new life for themselves or imagine something different.
Have you ever heard She Died for Love at 3 a.m.? Huh? Bill Anderson. You know, it's a great song. You remember that song, In the Shadows of the Warm Red Wine? Long black veils. Oh, don't sing it. Long black veils. She shawls.
I'll skip a little bit, try and get them to play together.
Nearly 22. Neither good nor bad, just a kid like you. Then I got lost, too late to pray. I started going down, and lost my way.
All right. So hopefully you're seeing that that there's this lineage, right? And what's interesting is Thomas Torino, he has this take of what the folk revival is. So some people think of a folk revival or a revival in general, like I mentioned before, as bringing something back, right? That was non-existent, that died. But Torino says the folk revival is not a revival of something that died, but an adoption of musical influences, styles, and imagery of rural and working class musics, right? So taking all these signs, these iconic and indexical and even some cases symbolic signs, both sonic and just image wise too, uh, and not trying to revive something that apparently died, but just trying to incorporate these life ways and musical styles into your own, right? And so much of it, just like when we watched that Pete Seeger video and they showed that flashback to Woody Guthrie, it's trying to, that's a good example of trying to draw from a certain imagery, right, of this rural and working class life and music style. So it's not really something that ever died, right? When we talk about the folk revival, it's just adopting, right, certain musical practices. The Beatles did this. There was also a blues revival in the 1960s, and blues music never died not by any means, but groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and a lot of those UK groups, Jimi Hendrix, they adopted older blues traditions and used that to create the rock and roll that we're familiar with today. So think of a revival as that. It's not always about something that died or is not popular anymore. It's just people looking back and trying to draw the essence of something. All right. So just to give you a little recap of the chronology that we just went through, right? Remember we started talking about some of the key European American and African American influences that really laid the foundation for commercial country music, right? The Carter family type, down home, rural sound, Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers in the 1920s that had this notion of simplicity and community. And from there, we see certain offshoots like bluegrass music and old time musical practices that were starting to occur. And then also the folk revival, right? In the 1940s and the 1950s, which draws from all these different influences, right? So this just goes to show how complicated these musical lineages are. It's not as easy to say, oh, country is white people music and hip hop is black people music, right? There's usually these really complex cultural lineages and heritages that we can trace.